nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram namashristam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim goshtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham prapto yasya pratita kripaya Shri Gurum Tam Natosmi Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitam Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Manandavam Murdna Nipatyakshitu Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pridayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Seva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhattadasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puram Adadanastrinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhudisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Bhatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the foremost of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today, we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we'll resume here in the Nam Prakaran, the Nam Mahatmya, discussing the greatness of Sri Bhagavan's name. So in the last class we discussed a couple of verses that spoke about the name's intrinsic characteristics of being non-different than Bhagavan, of being a form of Parabrahman, as well as other extrinsic characteristics such as it purifying the mind, purging one of sin, leading one to have bhakti to the Guru, bringing about the realization of knowledge, ultimately bringing about the attainment of service to Bhagavan himself. So today we'll continue. We've got another 5 or 6 verses in this Prakaran. So we'll continue with discussion of the Nam Mahatmya. So I'm starting from verse 26. Having thus cited this verse which describes the name's extrinsic characteristic of being a fulfiller of all desires, and intrinsic characteristics of being an embodiment of consciousness and rasa, complete, pure, eternally liberated, and non-different from Sri Bhagavan, the compiler next cites a verse that illustrates the name's greatness on account of being the essence of the 4 Vedas, and yet also worshipable to and a deliverer of human beings, including even chandalas, that is, those who are ineligible to directly engage in study of the Vedas and the practices the Vedas enjoin. So this is wonderful. What is not accessible to those who are ineligible to study the Veda, to practice what is taught in the Veda, for them, Harinam is available and can give them something more than anything they could learn or practice in the Vedas could do so. So they're not disenfranchised, they're rather fully eligible or fully capable of attaining the ultimate spiritual object. So that's stated, among other important points, in the following verse, which comes to us from the Skanda Purana. Madhura-madhuram etan maṅgalaṁ maṅgalānāṁ sakala-nigama-vallī-sat-phalaṁ cit-svarūpam sakṛd parigītaṁ śraddhayā helayā bhṛgu-vara nara-mātraṁ tārayet kṛṣṇa-nāma. O best of the Bhṛgus, the name of Krishna, the sweetest of the sweet, the most auspicious of the auspicious, of the essential nature of consciousness, the excellent fruit of the vine of all the Vedas, can deliver any human being when chanted even once, respectfully or easily. Commenting on this verse in his Digdarshani Tika on Hari Bhakti Vilas, Sri Sanatana Goswami Pad states that, quote, the name of Krishna, or kṛṣṇa-nāma, here can be interpreted to refer either to the name Krishna specifically or to a name of Krishna, that is, any name of Sri Bhagavan in general. So the subject of the verse is, quote, kṛṣṇa-nāma. So does that mean Rama-nama won't do? Only Krishna-nama is being mentioned? Or does that mean Rama-nama, Govinda, Hari, all will do? So Sanatana Goswami clarifies that it can refer to any name of Bhagavan, not only the name of Krishna. Just, therefore, Krishna here is what's called an upalakshana, or an indicator of a category of which it is a part. So, that name of Bhagavan, or that name of Krishna, the commentator gives two interpretations of the various qualifiers that describe it. The first being the sweetest of the sweet, madhura-madhuram. The sweetness of chanting the name of Sri Bhagavan is even sweeter than the sweetness of chanting his glories. And even in the state of moksha, the sweetness of chanting his name is sweeter, that is more relishable, than moksha itself. So he's giving a reason for this double reference to sweet. If chanting the name of Krishna was sweet, you could just say madhuram once. But to say it's the sweetest of the sweet means there's got to be some other type of sweetness that's being compared to the name of Krishna, and the name of Krishna being considered more sweet than that. So what is that implied other category of sweetness that's being compared? So he's giving two options. One could be the sweetness of other things that are also chanted, such as the glories of Krishna or the qualities of Krishna. So to say that chanting his names is even sweeter than chanting his glories, then is possible as one interpretation. Perhaps some might not like to necessarily make a harsh distinction between the two, nor is there a necessity to, but it may be found that for those who are deeply steeped and realized in his qualities and his leelas, then to sing of them in the condensed form of his names can be felt to be especially relishable. This is one way it could be expressed. Or, the second option he's giving is that moksha, or the experience of something pure and spiritual in nature, is what is worthy of being described as sweet. But even amongst all that can be experienced by liberated souls, this nama sankirtan is the sweetest of all things relishable to them. Therefore, it is the sweetest of the sweet. These are his two interpretations. The commentator interprets the most auspicious of the auspicious, maṅgalaṁ maṅgalānāṁ, to mean that the name is even more auspicious than other auspicious acts, like hearing the Puranas. So, elsewhere, as the commentator introduced the verse, to say that the name leads to an attainment that's beyond what following the practices enjoined in the Vedas refers to. You could then take the auspiciousness here to refer to the various rites, rituals, customs, sacrifices, and so forth enjoined in the Veda, and say that the name is even more auspicious than them. So these are the points made by the Padyavali commentator. Sanatan Pad has another related point. He says, Sri Sanatan Pad explains that the name is stated to be the supreme fruit of the Vedas because it is the sweetest of the sweet, the most auspicious of the auspicious, and of the essential nature of consciousness, that is, of the nature of Brahman. So the fruit is typically the sweetest part of the tree, the most desirable or relishable part of the tree. So he's taking it that because the name has these qualities, it's worthy of being described as the fruit of the Veda, or the ultimate thing that can be attained from the textual corpus known as the Veda. And he adds that because it is such, it can deliver any human being when chanted even once, respectfully or easily. Meaning, moksha will occur concomitantly for anyone as a result of chanting the name even once in any manner. So this thing which is the most essential or wonderful feature of the Veda, it has this power. While other practices or other elements of the Veda may require repeated practice or rigorous discipline and so forth, this name, which is the very essence of all of those things, or the greatest amongst them, it has such power that if it's chanted even once, it can produce liberation. This would be the sense. He also adds that the prefix pari in the word parigītaṁ, chanted, can be taken to indicate that even if the pronunciation of the name is incomplete or inarticulate, the result will still occur. The commentator adds that when the name is here compared to a fruit, the mention of its being, quote, of the essential nature of consciousness, cit-svarūpam, precludes the notion that it is a fruit with a peel, seed, and other discardable parts, in case you were worried. The distinction being that unlike fruits of the earth with discardable parts, the fruit of the Vedas is made only of letters and rasa, that is of the nature of consciousness. So because this fruit is made of consciousness, you don't have to worry about a peel or a seed or other things. Now, we'll get into a little more detail when it comes to this phrase, śraddhayā helayā. Regarding the name being chanted, quote, respectfully or easily, the commentator explains that this refers to the name being chanted intentionally or spontaneously, and gives the following explanation. When some bhakta has sung Krishna's name, then upon hearing that, someone else's respect may arise for that, such that they think, "Aho, he sings well. I too shall sing so." Then, when that listener sings the name, another person, upon hearing that, may think, "What is he singing? I too shall sing this spontaneously. Listen," and then sing the name. In either case, that is, when the name is chanted intentionally or spontaneously, it can deliver any human being from the ocean of samsara. So, what's significant about this interpretation is the view of the meaning of the word helayā, which is the root being hela. So you'll find some translators have given this as negligently or disregardingly or something like this, but as we'll see from this comment as well as the comments that will come, that translation, although it's accurate as per the dictionary, is not actually in keeping with the intention of the verse or the teachings of the Bhagavatam. So I know that the way I've given it here as, quote, easily sounds, it's a little bit of a secondary usage of the word easily as we typically use it in English, but I felt that it was necessary to give it like this to convey what we'll get to in Jiva Goswami's commentary on the Bhagavatam in a minute, and to preclude the idea of it referring to negligence or disrespect. So here, the commentator is giving his view that it refers to something spontaneous, something light-hearted, something that just happened, for fun. The way, we've seen hundreds of times when doing Nagar Sankirtan, people startled looking at us, what are these people singing? And then sometimes spontaneously joining in with no idea what it means or what its purpose is, but just for the fun of it, or just for whatever reason they're inclined to just repeat the words on that occasion at that moment. So something like that in a light-hearted manner is what is referred to according to the commentator. But let's look a little more closely at this with reference to the following verse in the Bhagavatam. The following verse in Srimad Bhagavatam conveys relevant considerations, however, in regard to the manners of uttering the name that lead to liberation. Whether as a designation, a joke, an interposition, or just an act of ease, helayā, know an utterance of the name of Vaikuntha, or that is of Sri Bhagavan, to be a remover of all sins. Sri Sridhar Samipad interprets the term helayā, which is synonymous with the instrumental form of the word hela in the verse under discussion, to mean disregard, avagya, and gives the example of someone disrespectfully remarking, "What of Vishnu?" That is, speaking the name of Sri Bhagavan in the process of making a denigrating, sarcastic remark about him. So it's a little bit terse, but the idea is, if some competitors in some sport are talking about a competition, and then one well-known competitor's name is mentioned, oh, what about him? Will you fight him, or will you, play a game against him? Then someone might say, what of him? Meaning like, he's nobody, I will conquer him, as a way of speaking dismissively about the person. This is the sense that, or as some asuras might, in their plots to take over the three worlds, say, we're going to attack Svarga and oust Indra, but won't Narayan again come to save Indra? What of Narayan? We will, defeat him as well. This type of manner of speaking. So, although in that context one is speaking the name Narayan or the name of Vishnu, one is speaking it in a manner or with an intent that is denigrating or defaming of Narayan. So will that liberate you? Any mention of the name of Bhagavan will do. Just say his name and you're liberated, even if you're saying his name for the sake of denigrating him. So according to Sridhar Swami, that's the case. That's the way he's interpreting it. However, Sri Jivapad disagrees with this interpretation. So this is, anytime Jiva Goswami explicitly disagrees with Sridhar Swami, it's usually always interesting. So I gave a little, I thought it was worth adding this discussion here, because anytime Jiva Goswami takes issue with Sridhar Swami's points, it's usually because there's some significant element in the Bhagavatam itself that appears to be contradicted by what was said. So he states the following. Here, helanam, as in the expression, quote, the hill was lifted easily, refers specifically to an absence of exertion, and not rather to disrespectfulness. This is to be understood. When this is so, then faultiness certainly existed in Vena. So he's saying, he's giving a different interpretation, and there's so many cases where Jiva Goswami may offer an alternate interpretation to Sridhar Samipad, but then he's saying, Natu, but he's coming back and then he's directly disagreeing with Sridhar Swami's statement. So that's what I'm referring to as something, that is more poignant. In other words, it's not just a complementary or alternative viewpoint. He's specifically not accepting Sridhar Swami's view in this case. And then he's stating the reason. Why does Sridhar Swami's interpretation pose a problem? Because it would imply that there was no fault in Maharaj Vena. So, I've given a little bit of mention of this in the explanation. Sri Jivapad's point here is that when helanam is construed to mean ease rather than disrespect, as it was construed by Sri Sridhar Samipad, then the necessity of there being faultiness in King Vena, who is observed to pronounce the name of Sri Bhagavan disrespectfully, and not only to have not attained moksha, but rather to have met with severe degradation, is maintained. If helanam is construed to mean disrespect, then it would convey the idea that persons who speak disrespectfully of Bhagavan have all their sins purified as a result of their doing so. This import would contradict the account of King Vena in Srimad Bhagavatam itself, which teaches the opposite. So King Vena was the son of Prahlad, and he was killed by a group of brahmanas through a plan that they had, which they felt duty-bound to execute because his attitudes were asuric and very detrimental to the world. So although he was found on occasion to speak the name of Bhagavan, he did so only for the sake of defaming Bhagavan and was, so to speak, dead against him. So the account goes that as a result of these offenses, he did not attain moksha, rather he was killed and met with, a lower future condition. So this is stated in the Bhagavatam itself. So if we interpret this statement to mean, oh yeah, you can speak disrespectfully of Bhagavan and still get moksha, then that would create a contradiction to this narration where someone did just that and didn't get moksha and rather got degradation. So therefore, to uphold consistency with this account in the Bhagavatam and this word in the Bhagavatam, Jiva Goswami is saying that we shouldn't interpret the word helanam to refer to disrespect, because the account of King Vena shows that you're not allowed to speak the name of Bhagavan with disrespect. Therefore, we should harness or employ a different sense that the word helanam can convey, and namely the sense of ease. So this is the Jiva Goswami's logic. And he adds to what he said the following. A fault is heard of also in the counter-instruction in regard to the faithless and so forth among the 10 offenses to the name mentioned in Padma Purana. Here, Sri Jivapada is referring to the 9th of the 10 offenses to Sri Bhagavan's name, mentioned in Padma Purana. That is, instructing one who is faithless, averse, or undesirous of hearing about the name is an offense to the name. Sri Jivapada's point is that the implied meaning of this instruction is that it is certainly an offense for someone to pronounce the name disrespectfully, if it is considered an offense even to encourage persons who are faithless and averse to pronounce it. So in other words, Jiva Goswami is drawing out an implied meaning here. It's saying, the Padma Purana is saying, to instruct someone to chant who's faithless, who's averse to doing so, is an offense to the name. So what he's saying is, if it's an offense to tell someone to chant who's disrespectful, then actually chanting disrespectful, is that an offense? Definitely. It's definitely an offense to chant the name with disrespect, so much so that to even act so as to create the circumstance in which that could occur, even that's an offense, because there's trying to draw a preventative barrier or a deterrent from even that dynamic arising in the first place. So he's saying that because it's an offense to tell people to chant that way, it's definitely an offense. Because it's an offense to tell people who are disrespectful to chant, it's definitely an offense to chant disrespectfully. So, if we were to interpret helanam to mean avagya or disrespect, then it would contradict this principle taught amongst the 10 offenses to the name. So this is a second argument that Jiva Goswami is giving for why he's differing from Sridhar Samipad in this case. Thus, chanting the name, quote, respectfully or easily, as well as Sri Sanatan Pad's remark about the name being chanted even once, quote, in any manner, should be understood to mean in any manner save for a manner that is disrespectful, that is offensive. So Sanatan, by giving a simple explanation, so to speak, however you chant, you'll get liberation, is not meant to be taken to the nth degree, but to be taken in general. So, but to be precise, any manner that's not an offense, or to chant easily or in some manner, as long as it's not disrespectful. This is the balance point, if you will, that Jiva Goswami wants to maintain in this line of thought. And this is an example of how statements taken out of context, or individual statements not read in the context of the rest of the teachings of the Shastra, can lead to erroneous conclusions, which are grammatically or literally accurate as per a isolated statement, but don't actually hold up to the collective analysis and the collective conclusion that arrives from the broader body of the text. Following Sri Jivapad's line of thought in regard to the meaning of helanam, Sri Chakravartipad adds the following. When this is so, that is, when helanam is construed to mean ease rather than disrespect, as it was construed by Sri Sridhar Samipad, there is preservation of an understanding of faultiness in defamers of Bhagavan, in accord with the statement in Srimad Bhagavatam, quote, upon hearing defamation of Bhagavan or persons devoted to him, even one who does not move away from there loses one's merit and falls down. Sri Chakravartipad's implied point here is that if it is an offense to even listen to someone speak derogatorily of Sri Bhagavan, then it is certainly an offense to speak that way of him oneself. Thus, the commentator's interpretation of helayā in the verse under discussion as, quote, easily or spontaneously, rather than negligently or disrespectfully, is appropriate. And the notion of the name being pronounced in this manner, as described in the verse under discussion, can also be taken as an indicator of the other types of namabhas mentioned in the aforesaid verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, that is, of the name being chanted as a designation, a joke, or an interposition. Sri Chakravartipad explains these as follows. So what is being added here is that the verse under discussion is referring to namabhas. So to say it can be chanted respectfully or easily. In other words, it can be chanted respectfully or in one of these manners of namabhas. Does that mean that the other forms of namabhas won't do? No, it means they will also do, and that we can take it that because one type of namabhas is alluded to in the verse, the implication is that the other types of namabhas are as well. So what are those types of namabhas? Then we have Chakravartipad's explanation of them here. He says, quote, as a designation means designating a son or someone else, as in the case of Ajamil calling his son Narayan. As a joke refers only to one filled with affinity in regard to Sri Bhagavan, and not rather filled with defamation in regard to Sri Bhagavan. As in the case of the remark, O you of widely known greatness, O name of Krishna, I have seen your supposed greatness since you are unable to deliver me. So this is a sarcastic remark. Oh yeah, everybody says that you chant the name of Krishna once and you get liberation. Well, where's my liberation? I've chanted many times. In other words, if you speak like this about the name, that doesn't count, or that's not going to get you anywhere. So although such a remark contains a name of Sri Bhagavan, such utterance of Sri Bhagavan's name does not purify one of sin, because the name is uttered for the sake of defamation of Sri Bhagavan in this case. So in other words, if you make a joke that has Bhagavan's name in it, as long as he's not the butt of the joke, it's okay. As an interposition means done for the purpose of completing a narration, song, or statement. Okay, so these are the 4 types of namabhas mentioned in this verse. And sometimes people like to make these sort of standardized lists of things, and there's a common saying of there are, quote, 4 types of namabhas. However, Chakravartipad, on the following verse of the Bhagavatam, says that there's another type of namabhas mentioned after that. So according to Chakravartipad, there's actually 5 types of namabhas. So that following verse is as follows. Having fallen, slipped, been injured, been bitten, been burnt, or been beaten, a person who helplessly says Hari does not deserve tribulations. So in other words, if out of helplessness or a shock, someone suddenly chants the name, then that's also a type of namabhas. Like if one's walking in the forest and suddenly sees a snake and says, ah! Like hurry or something like this in fear, then this would be an account of such namabhas. Finally, it is also noteworthy that Sri Sanatana Pad cites this verse in Hari Bhakti Vilas to illustrate the name's being itself the supreme Purushartha. And Sri Jivapad cites it in Bhagavat Sandarbha to demonstrate that the name is a form of Sri Bhagavan himself, since that which is the fruit of all the Vedas can be nothing other than Sri Bhagavan himself. So this is an interesting point from Sri Jivapad. Although this verse doesn't, as we saw in the previous verse, explicitly say that the name and the bearer of the name, the nama and the namin are non-different, he's saying that this verse implies it, because his view is that the fruit of the Vedas, or the ultimate fruition, the ultimate object that the Vedas are about, has to be Bhagavan. And if the name is being said to be the fruit of the Vedas, then that means the name is not different than Bhagavan. This is his line of thought. So, because the verse speaks of the name as the fruit of the Veda, the implication is that the name is non-different than Bhagavan, because it's generally understood that Bhagavan is the ultimate object taught in the Veda. So, similarly, Sanatana Pad's point that the name is the supreme Purushartha can be interpreted along those same lines, and moreover that it's the sweetest of the sweet, or the auspicious of the auspicious, can also mean that there's no greater object to attain than this. So in this way, we have an understanding of this statement. So now we'll come to the following verse, unless there's any comment or question on that one. Okay, so having thus cited a verse that demonstrates the name's greatness in being the fruit of all the Vedas and a deliverer of all human beings by the most simple and accessible means of simply being pronounced, the compiler next cites a verse that describes the apt practical response to receiving such knowledge. That is, leaving aside all forms of sadhana taught in the Vedas, which are all lesser in value in comparison to the sadhana of Namakirtan, and all other objects of attainment apart from Sri Bhagavan, which are lesser in greatness in comparison to attainment of him, the attainment of him, and instead engaging in the sadhana of chanting Krishna's name. So, if by chanting the name you can achieve what is beyond the Veda, and you don't even need to go through the rigor that's found in the Veda, then why bother with all this Vedic achar? Why not just take the name and achieve something greater? It's easier and more beneficial, Like, why work 10 hours getting paid a low wage when you could work 2 hours getting paid more money at a higher, earn more money getting paid a much higher wage and do less work? Just by the conventional notion of efficiency, the principle of the nam sadhana as taught by this line of thought would be superior to any form of Vedic achar. So that's alluded to in the following verse. Svargārthīyā vyavasitir asau dīnayaty lokān mokṣāpekṣā janayati janaṁ kevalaṁ kleśabhājam yogābhyāsaḥ parama-virasas tadrishaikim prayasai sarvam tyakta mamatu rasana kṛṣṇa-nāma rotu. The resolve to attain svarga by performing yaga and so on verily impoverishes people. Desire for moksha just causes people to undergo hardship, and yoga practice is completely devoid of rasa. What is the use of such pursuits? Having rejected them all, let my tongue instead call out, Krishna, Krishna. So this is a strong remark. He's making nothing uncertain, leaving nothing unclear. He's directly denouncing the karma marg, the jnana marg, and the yoga marg, and saying, follow the bhakti marg, and do nama sankirtan. And he gives his reasons why. So we'll look at those here in the commentary. The commentator explains that, quote, verily, eva, indicates that the resolve to attain svarga seldom ever leads to the attainment of svarga, because there are usually imperfections in the pronunciation of the mantras and in the performance of other procedures required in the yajnas conducted for the purpose of attaining that domain. And even if anyone does attain svarga by performing yajnas, such an attainment is neither permanent nor capable of freeing one from envy and other vices that arise when one sees that another's pleasure is greater than one's own. The purport being that because the attainment of svarga is not a cause of truly desirable happiness, its only effect, ironically, is impoverishment of the people who attain it, or the persons who attain it, even though people typically seek to attain it because they have the idea that it is a place of prosperity and enjoyment. So people want svarga to enjoy, but when they get there, if they ever do, they actually don't fully enjoy it. This is shown in the Bhagavatamrita, where Gopakumar, when he becomes Indra, he appreciates, the speciality of the place to the extent that it exists. But what pains him is that people are still envious of each other. People are still suffering from tinges in their character. And, the rich, famous, and powerful of the world, if they have a bit of clarity of mind, then this is all too apparent that even if they have all kinds of facility, all means of sensual enjoyment, all means of fame and what have you, when their own minds are impure, when they suffer from character defects, they don't truly feel any satisfaction in the privileges or the special statuses that they supposedly enjoy. So just attaining svarga without that purification of mind that is fundamental to the path of bhakti is not actually that relishable of an attainment. And moreover, it's impermanent anyway. So ultimately, what does it do? He's saying that ultimately it just impoverishes people, or it just drains them of their resources, their efforts, but doesn't truly return them anything of great value. So in this way, he's dismissing the karma marg. The word moksha in the verse refers to awareness of undifferentiated Brahman, and desire for it ultimately proves to be not only fruitless, but a cause of hardship in a manner similar to threshing thick chaff. Since, in comparison to the sadhana on the path of bhakti, the sadhana on the path of jnana that excludes bhakti is troublesome to perform and produces only troublesome effects. This is also described in Srimad Bhagavatam. So we were just discussing this passage in the last Chaitanya Charitamrita class we had. So I won't go into much explanation of it since we just heard it, but giving a compressed version with the most poignant point, which came in Sanatan Pad's Tika. So this is as follows. O Lord, for those who abandon the path of bhakti to you, that from which there is a flow of auspiciousness, and struggle to attain awareness of oneness, only this hardship remains and nothing else, as in the case of those who thresh thick chaff. Sri Sanatana Goswami Pad comments as follows in this regard. Quote, the result of svarga and so forth, and of purification of the psyche and so forth, is negated by the word only. That is, those those who follow the path of gyan, neglecting the path of bhakti, do not attain svarga and other pleasures or purification of the psyche and other such forms of removal of suffering. That is, they do not even attain the results that one can attain by following the path of karma. An objection is raised. Well, certainly the attainment of prestige and wealth will come about as a result of the exertion of yoga practice, and so on. It means, well, maybe they won't get svarga, maybe they won't get purified in mind, but at least they'll get some fame in the world, or people will give them money thinking they're some great sadhu. To this he says, nothing else. That is, no. Nothing else will come about at all. An apt illustration in this regard is as follows. Quote, as one is mocked as a fool by people for threshing thick chaff, and only mere pain in the hands and so forth shall occur by smashing already thoroughly pulverized chaff, so too is the meaning. That is, so too, one who engages in the toil of the path of gyan devoid of bhakti sadhana does not attain prestige or wealth, but rather only ridicule and personal hardship. And again, as we discussed in that other class, he's speaking here specifically about those who tried to follow the path of gyan, excluding all practice of bhakti from the path of gyan. But those who follow the path of gyan, integrating some aspect of bhakti as a secondary element, that can lead to liberation, and that is not what's being censured here, just for reference and for social responsibility, because sometimes people take these type of statements to refer to anyone following any type of practice based on Advaita Vedanta, and then they, make insensitive and sometimes very disrespectful remarks towards or about people who are not ever meant to be, who's referred to by such statements in the Shastra or the works of earlier acharyas. So these points are also to be dealt with respect and sensitivity. In any case, the point here is that the author is saying the desire for moksha just causes hardship. So what he's saying is that the desire for moksha will motivate one to follow the path of gyan, and he's implying or he's assuming that the person pursuing moksha by the path of gyan is not going to incorporate a secondary element of bhakti into the process. And so they don't, then it's true, they'll end up only undergoing difficulty, as this verse in the Bhagavatam that was cited shows. So then lastly, for the third element, yoga practice is described as, quote, completely devoid of rasa, because it is exceedingly troublesome to perform. So here obviously this is not talking about modern day, synthetic matte, essential oil diffuser, hand pan music infused, exercise in an air-conditioned yoga studio. This is referring to the highly austere practice of pratyahar and dhyan, following all niyamas, following all yamas, brahmacharya, having done extensive pranayam, living in total isolation, that classical path of Ashtanga yoga, as it was done, based on, the Patanjali Sutras, the Nath yogis and others. That path is very difficult to perform and doesn't contain any, quote, rasa, or it's an entirely dry, meditative, self-restrictive process. So he's saying that taking up that process is not ideal because it's very difficult, it's very dry. And so he's drawing a contrast between the dryness of that path and the sweetness of chanting Krishna's name. We just heard in the last verse, this name of Krishna is the sweetest of the sweet, it's the fruit of the Veda. So do you really want to, go off on such a dry pursuit, or do you want to taste this sweetness? Do you want to have a taste of this fruit? This is perhaps a little bit of the suggestion by putting that quote after this one. So lastly, the commentator interprets the intent of the conclusion of the verse as follows, quote, if anyone makes efforts to attain those objectives, fine, let them do so. But having rejected them all, my tongue, let my tongue instead call out Krishna, Krishna. So again, he's not stopping anybody, or he's not trying to hurt anyone's feelings or abuse them or anything. He's saying, do what you have to do, do as you see fit, but this is my conviction. This is what I find self-satisfying and relishable. So, the author interprets the name Krishna, the author repeats the name Krishna twice because of the profusion of its superlative greatness, or because of the profusion of its sweetness. So in other words, you could have just said, I've rejected them all, let my tongue just chant the name of Krishna. That would have been clear, but so why does he have to say Krishna twice? So he's saying he has to say Krishna twice. Why? Because the name of Krishna is so sweet, because it's such a great thing, that out of my, its endearing qualities, it's worth saying twice. Something like this is how he's drawing out the significance. All right, then let's see, I think we have time for one more. So we'll come to verse 28. Having thus cited a verse that extols chanting of the name as the foremost of sadhanas, the compiler next cites a verse that describes the greatness of the name by indicating that the name as a sadhana has a greatness that even the personal form of Swayam Bhagavan Sri Krishna does not have. So this is from Sridhar Samipad. Sada sarvatraste nanu vimalam adyatava param tatapekam stokam nahi bhavataru patramabhinat kṛṣṇam jivagristam tavatu bhagavan nama nikidam samula samsaram kashati katarat sevyamanayo. O Bhagavan, your spotless primordial feet are certainly present everywhere at all times. Even so, they have not been able to cut away even one small leaf of the tree of worldly life. Your name, abiding on the tip of the tongue for even a moment, however, destroys the entirety of samsara along with its root. So, which of these two is to be served? So, samsara is compared to a tree, and he's saying that this all-pervading form of Bhagavan, it doesn't even remove one leaf off the tree. But the name, what to speak of removing one leaf, what to speak of removing all the leaves, what to speak of removing the whole tree, it even removes the roots of the tree. So, therefore, the name is the object that we should serve. This is what he wants to say. Sri Bhagavan's form is spoken of in this verse with great adoration by mention of Sri Bhagavan's, quote, spotless primordial feet. So, in other words, when he's talking about the feet of Bhagavan, that doesn't just mean the feet only and not the ankles and the knees and the rest of his body. It means Bhagavan's form, and it's spoken of just by reference to the feet as a way of showing adoration for that. So the commentator explains that, quote, spotless here means free from even a trace of mundanity, and primordial means the cause of everything. That is, Sri Bhagavan's form is the cause of both itself and all else in existence. That Sri Bhagavan's form is, quote, certainly present everywhere at all times, means that it is eternally all-pervading. As is stated by Sri Bhagavan himself in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, quote, this entire universe is pervaded by me in my unmanifest form. And this is a topic that Jiva Goswami discusses repeatedly throughout the Bhagavad Sandarbha. From, I think it's in the late 20s or the early 30s, the Anuchedas there, he goes up till around the 60s, maybe 3 or 4 times he comes back and he quotes repeatedly and discusses many verses in the Bhagavatam that make this point, that sometimes we get this linear hierarchical idea of lokas and Vaikuntha being like above the earth, as if what is in Vaikuntha is not here, it's far up in the sky. But actually the way it's described is that these are more subtle, all-pervading realms. So the realm of Goloka, the realm of Vaikuntha, those are pervading the entirety of the material expanse. So to speak, right here, right now, Vaikuntha, Goloka is all present in a subtle, all-pervading manner. And everything within it, and specifically Bhagavan's form, is pervading the entirety of existence. So, you might say, well then why don't I see it? Or, how is that? So, although Sri Bhagavan's form is such, it is not perceptible to all living beings throughout the universe. As he has explained elsewhere in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, quote, covered by Yogamaya, I am not manifest to all. So though you don't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there. Sridhar Samipad explains the term Yogamaya in this verse, explains that the term Yogamaya in this verse refers to Sri Bhagavan's extraordinary power of sagacity that can make the impossible possible, and that his not being perceptible to all because of this covering of Yogamaya indicates that he is perceptible only to his bhaktas. So in other words, he's all-pervading, but he's only perceived by some. In other words, those who have bhakti, those who are blessed with the influence of the Sarup Shakti over their cognitive faculties, they're able to perceive him, but those who are not, are not. Sri Bhagavan's being of this nature is vividly illustrated in a statement of Srimad Bhagavatam describing Mother Yashoda's binding of Sri Krishna. So, quote, who has neither interior, nor exterior, nor anterior, nor posterior, who is the anterior, posterior, interior, and exterior of the universe, who is the universe, and who is beyond sense perception, unmanifest, and possessed of human characteristics. Considering him her son, the Gopika bound him with a rope, to a mortar, like an ordinary child. So this is quite an extraordinary, apparently contradictory statement, right? To say that he has no inside, he has no outside, he has nothing existed before him, nothing exists after him, and he is what exists before, what exists after, what exists inside, what exists outside the universe, and he is the universe, and he's also imperceptible in the universe, he's also not manifest in the universe, and he's also full of all the characteristics of a human being, in other words, those who we most commonly see in the universe. Wow, he has all of these characteristics simultaneously, and this gopi, Mother Yashoda, was able, despite his being all-pervading and infinite and so on, was able to tie him up. So Jiva Goswami discusses this point, interestingly, in his commentaries, and a few of the essential remarks he makes are given here. Sri Jiva Goswami Pad explains in this regard that Leelas such as Mother Yashoda's binding of Sri Krishna illustrate that his divine form is all-pervading, even while also simultaneously existing in medium size, that is, in a size of conventional human proportion, and that these two mutually exclusive characteristics can co-inhere in him, because he is possessed of inconceivable potency, that is, the capacity to do that which is conventionally understood to be impossible. So although it's a contradiction, it's okay, because as it's given in the Lagu Bhagavatamrita from, I forget which Purana, Bhagavan is he who who's defined as he who possesses the ability to do what is impossible for others. That's Bhagavan. Start with that. Moreover, Sri Jiva Pad explains, it is the flow of bliss emanating from the rasa of Mother Yashoda's Vatsalya prema that suppresses perception of his all-pervasiveness, and thus makes Sri Krishna not only perceptible to her as being of conventional human proportion, but also bindable with a rope. So this is a fantastic comment. In other words, although he has ontologically all of these characteristics simultaneously, despite the fact that it seems impossible, it's prema, or it's the bliss that is experienced in a flow as a result of relishing the rasa of this prema that captivates him to the extent that he enables himself to be perceived, not only perceived, but bound by this bhakta, by this parikara who has such prema for him. So he can be all-pervading, he can also not be. And he's compelled to not be by the prema, by the bliss of relishing the rasa of the prema of his bhaktas. Thus, in the verse under discussion, when it is said, quote, "Your spotless primordial feet are certainly present everywhere at all times. Even so, they have not been able to cut away even one small leaf of the tree of worldly life." The sense is that although Sri Bhagavan is all-pervading and present everywhere always, he is only perceptible to his prema bhaktas. And thus, for those who have no such bhakti and are bound in the illusory conditioning of Maya, Sri Bhagavan's all-pervading form is not a cause of deliverance from samsara in the least. So, Mother Yashoda, she can see Krishna, but common conditioned souls cannot. So this all-pervading, ever-existent divine form verily exists, but is inaccessible to those to whom it's not self-manifest. So, although it's there, it doesn't actually, or it's not actually instrumental in the deliverance of jivas from Maya. As was stated in verse 25, the name of Sri Bhagavan is regarded as non-different from Sri Bhagavan himself. And the author stresses in the second half of the verse that it is this aspect of Sri Bhagavan that is the deliverer of jivas from samsara along with its root. That is, along with the inclinations, vasanas, ingrained in the psyche that induce a jiva to perpetuate their own entanglement in samsara. Thus, the answer to the author's rhetorical question, which of these two is to be served, is that the name of Sri Bhagavan is the rightful primary object of worship of the conditioned jiva, since this form of Bhagavan is accessible to conditioned jivas, whereas the form, Sri Bhagavan's form, remains imperceptible to them until they attain prema bhakti. So, this is relevant to the idea of, quote, the name being non-different than Bhagavan, or the name of Bhagavan and the form of Bhagavan being non-different. That's true, they are non-different, but are they non-different in all respects? No, they're non-different in some respects. Just as in the famous so-called Mahavakya Tattvam Asi, you are that, or the Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, then these statements are true in a particular qualified sense, according to our theology, as Jiva Goswami explains. If we say, quote, that is Brahman, and specifically Brahman, the aspect of Brahman focused on the idea of Brahman being something that's constituted of consciousness rather than matter, then we can say, yes, you are Brahman, because the jiva is also something that's fundamentally constituted of consciousness and not matter, like Brahman is. So when the shared property of the two is being referred to, we can say that the two are non-different on that basis. But that doesn't imply that the two are non-different in all other respects. And this is how sometimes we see people misinterpret things, where, one statement of non-difference based on one shared property is made between two elements, and then they say, oh look, that means they're non-different, that means all these other things must be equal too. But this is not how it works. Rather, every statement has an intended scope of meaning and application specific to a particular idea, or specific to a particular property of what's being described. So anytime we speak of oneness or difference, we always have to understand with respect to what shared property, or with respect to what particular quality, is this statement of oneness or of non-difference being made. And is that a permanent state of non-difference? Is it ontological? Is it circumstantial? Is it arising with cause? Is it arising without cause? This is where so many factors come up, and where the subtleties of Siddhanta come out, if you will. So, in this case, the name is non-different than Bhagavan. We just heard that in a previous verse. And now this verse is showing us a difference between Bhagavan in the sense of Bhagavan's form and Bhagavan's name. In that, although they are non-different in an ontological sense, they are different with respect to which is more instrumental or relevant to the deliverance of jivas in samsara. In this context, the name is different than the form. The name is well suited to, or has capacity to deliver jivas in a way that the form does not. Or rather, that the form doesn't typically express, although it's also within the realm of possibility. So in that way, we get this idea of both distinction and non-distinction with reference to different features of the name and of the form of Bhagavan. So, okay, I'll leave it at that. That's where we got the time today. So we've got a few more verses in this Nam Mahatmya Prakaran, so maybe in the next class or the one after that, we'll finish this section. And if anyone has any comments, questions, or otherwise, feel free to share. Yes, I see a hand.
Jayalada, Sri Sundar. Very nice presentation. Regarding the Namabhas, is there an acharya that states that Namabhas actually makes one eligible to enter Vaikuntha?
Yes. I mean, I'd have to look for an exact quote, but I can generally recall. But like I would say, as we discussed in a recent class, Jiva Goswami made this distinction between what he called kevala nam and sneha sangyukta nam, that when the name is chanted with affection, one can get samipya mukti, one can be in Vaikuntha and actually be in the presence of Bhagavan. But when the name is chanted without sneha, when it's just chanted, then one can get salokya, one can be in Vaikuntha, but not in the direct or close proximity of Bhagavan.
Okay. So it's possible. No, this Namabhas is quite interesting because, as you mentioned, Jiva Goswami said that if the intended chanting is with derision or offensive, it's not really liberating, although someone may chant name of God. So let's say somebody is chanting accidentally or just chants, and he doesn't have any feelings for Bhagavan, negative feelings, but just chants. Would that count as liberating?
Yeah, I think that would come under this helayā category that we discussed. Like, just spontaneously, freely, lightheartedly.
Yes. But that means that they have intention of dressing Bhagavan? Because Namabhas by itself means that you don't know why you're chanting this random without any particular address of feeling. That's Namabhas, right, as I understand.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, how this can liberate if somebody doesn't intend to be liberated or address particularly the name or associates the name with Bhagavan? That's my doubt.
Well, I mean, it's liberating in the sense that it purifies them of sin. I mean, if we look at the account of Ajamil, he's calling his son, right? He's not calling Bhagavan, he's calling his son, and that calling of his son purified him of his sins. And then, right, he got the chance to do further sadhana, to get some sadhu sangha, and then by that further installment, if you will, he got to go to Bhagavan. So, these things are also kind of to be conceived of within a timeline That according to the destiny of an individual, it might just be like they say one name and then poof, there they go, like disappear with some kind of special effects on them. Although there are cases of that are described. Like Baba one time he was sharing this account from, I think it's the Varaha Puran or some obscure Puran. I had to look it up and it took me a while to find it, but it talks about this Brahmin who's bathing in the river and saying Om Namo Narayana, Om Namo Narayana, doing some oblations, and then this tiger runs out of the jungle and leaps on him to eat him. And as the tiger is jumping on him, the tiger hears Om Namo Narayana, and the tiger gets liberated by hearing that Brahmin doing his chanting in the river. So there are these type of statements where the purifying power of hearing this name or chanting this name can have this type of effect. But then if you dig into the narration, he doesn't get, the proximity to Bhagavan or the seva to Bhagavan. He got, generic Sayujya Mukti.
So in the case of these Muslims that were chanting haram, haram in derision or mockingly when Mahaprabhu was born, and all the Vaishnavas on the other side of Ganga were chanting Hari, Hari, to counteract the effects of eclipse, where they were chanting Hari, Hari, and on the other side, Muslims were just mocking them, haram, haram, haram. It means stealing. How that affected, what kind of Damalhas was that? Because I heard this being quoted by someone as eligible Damalhas. Is it really Damalhas?
As you're saying, it depends on the mentality of the person. So if they were saying it derisively, then no, it wouldn't benefit them. But if they were saying it kind of lightheartedly for fun, kind of like, oh, look at them, they're having so much fun, they're going like this, like they're not necessarily against it or directly deprecating it, they're just kind of like enjoying it, if you will. I mean, perhaps some could have had an attitude like that, so... it can be hard to analyze the case of others. I think the principle is simply that if there is derogatory intent, then we know it's not going to work.
Okay, so case by case, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'll just make one comment here is that, sometimes we've heard so much praise of just chanting and how this chanting is just so powerful and so wonderful. And it does all these things like magic, But if we look at this comment that we discussed today about how the intent in the mind of the person is so relevant, and a point that we'll get to a little bit later on, which is a point that Baladev Vidyabhushan makes in a commentary he gives on another verse in the Padma Puran from the chapter about the 10 offenses, which explains how someone becomes free from offenses. And there's a verse, Namam Parad Yuktanam Naman Deva Harantyagam, that the names purify the offenses of those who have offenses to the names. But then it says, Avishranti Prayuktani Syadeva Artakarani, something like this, which means when they are applied incessantly, they're effective. Okay? So then sometimes people say, oh, that just means you have to chant constantly, 24 hours a day, just non-stop chanting. Right? That's what incessantly means. But Baladev Vidyabhushan gives a very interesting comment on this. He doesn't interpret incessantly as like, or like this whole thing, you know what I mean? His interpretation of incessantly is readily tolerating the consequences of all your past offenses. and sustaining the resolve to not commit future offenses and successively avoiding doing so. So what that comment means is that the very same thing, it comes back to the actual intent and psychology of the person. So this bhakti-anga, that bhakti-anga, whatever bhakti-anga, Harinam is the king of them all, and then ultimately even doing Harinam, it all boils down to the intent that people have in their minds. So it all boils down to the education and the quality of resolve that people are able to form about the aim of their existence. That's what's really meaningful. And all of these practices, all of these glorifications, all of this stuff is fine, but it's all riding fundamentally on the psychology that's going on in the mind of the person. And I find that to draw out how corely essential that is helpful for people to get a clear orientation about what to prioritize in their personal life of practice. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on the topic more broadly.
Yes, but as you mentioned, one of the glories of Harinam is that it purifies from offenses to itself, right? Yeah. So, in a way, the recommendation would be just chant, keep chanting, don't stop, and then within that continuity, establish yourself. Perhaps the name will help you because it purifies from offenses. Help you in establishing oneself in proper mindset by not committing offenses anymore and so on. So in a way, constant chanting has an effect, right? Because it will purify the consciousness of a chanter. At least that's the intention. What I can understand from what you said. The janaṁ can purify itself. The constant chanting would be meaningful and important. Is it not?
Well, I mean, what Baladev is saying is it will purify you if you have this attitude.
Okay, the if is the important. Okay, I didn't catch that. Okay.
Right? Abhishrani prayuktani, when the names are chanted in this way, they'll purify you. So that when, or that if, is when the person successfully refrains from committing future offense.
Oh, okay.
So the person has to, of course, be educated. What are these offenses? Yes. They have to understand what to avoid. Yes. Rather than like, just chant, oh yeah, it's like, if you took the time to educate the people what this stuff actually is, what are the subtleties of committing offense? Why do you commit offense? What are the underlying psychological triggers that give rise to offensive behavior? Like, just chuck all that out the window and say, yeah, Haribol, Haribol, Haribol. It's like, come on, man. It's you might want it to be that simple, and okay, if you wish it were that simple, I can relate to a certain extent. But when it really comes down to it, people have to have a clear ability. They have to use vivek. They have to be able to discern what is offensive and what is not, what leaves them prone to committing future offense and what does not, and they have to have the composure to some extent control their thoughts and behavior to preclude them committing future offenses. And the name will definitely help you do that, absolutely. But you need that orientation, and you need that, set of guidelines in order for the process to work.
Right. Thank you for that. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so often comes to my mind when I hear Jiva Goswami has different opinion than Srila Swami, and then kind of always the same question comes back to me, that Mahaprabhu, when he spoke to what's his name, Vallabhacharya in Puri, when Vallabhacharya had different commentary on Bhagavatam than Srila Swami, Mahaprabhu said, who is the wife who doesn't follow the husband? In paraphrasing, meaning that you have to follow Srila Swami in order to give proper commentary of Bhagavatam. So, in a way, Mahaprabhu really stressed on meaning or importance of following Srila Swami commentary at that time. And we hear Jiva Goswami, I hear quite often time he has different take on different topics, like today you mentioned, about the holy name when Jiva Swami, any type of chanting liberates, right? So Jiva Swami dissects that statement and creates under condition. It works, sometimes may or may not. So Jiva Swami in a way disagree or elaborates on Srila Swami. My question is, when Mahaprabhu said follow Srila Swami, is it like absolute statement or that was, I don't know, can you elaborate on that? Because I don't want to make to make a statement that would be judgmental. But if you understand where I'm going with this.
Sure. Well, I think obviously Mahaprabhu's statement is not absolute, because if it were absolute, there would be no point in writing any other commentary. Why would he have encouraged Sanatana Goswami and Rupa Goswami to write their books? They just say, oh, you just follow Sridhar Swami. It's all there. Mm-hmm. So what he means isn't like to the letter, to every single passage. What he means is that follow Sridhar Swami, like study his work, grasp the tremendous value of what he said, and go forward with that. That's what the Goswamis did. I mean, the great majority of the terminology that they employed, the principles that they employed are all there in the Bhavarta Deepika. It's a bit spaghetti, here and there, all these words, but it's there. I mean, the more you study the Bhavarta Deepika, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this actually, Sridhar Swami said, like, some things, at least for me, I'd always thought these are like the Goswami's ideas, and then it's like, wait a minute, that's also in the Bhavarta Deepika, that's also in the Bhavarta Deepika, I mean, it's amazing, like, the more you study the Bhavarta Deepika, you feel like profound reverence for Sridhar Swami. But at the same time, it's not that every single point that he ever made is what the Goswamis or what Mahaprabhu wanted to go forward with. They profoundly revered him, they highly honored him, he's immortal in our history, so to speak, but they had, some further development of thought and refinement of theology and so forth that they were taking forward on the basis of what Sridhar Swami developed. And Jiva Goswami, wherever he disagrees with Sridhar Swami, he does it very respectfully and never by name. He never goes, yeah, and this Sridhar said this, but that's wrong because blah, 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 the way you see in like modern, internet chat rooms and all of this. He speaks of Sridhar Swami meticulously, respectfully, everywhere in the plural, defers to him in so many places. And any time that he disagrees, he just disagrees with the idea. He never makes it explicit that he's, just trying to disagree with this person. So with great respect, with evident, meticulous following of his general presentation, Jiva Goswami developed what Sridhar Swami had put forward, and Rupa Sanatana obviously, were involved in that process. So, at least for me, when you look at all the examples and the points where Jiva Goswami does disagree, almost any cases of disagreement are, like in the case tonight, because there's an apparent contradiction with the Bhagavatam itself, or there's a problem with core points of theology that are essential to what the Gaudiyas are trying to go forward with, such as Krishna's to Bhagavan Svayam, or certain really core axiomatic points that are central to this, way of thinking that Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis want to bring forward. Unless there's something that's problematic at a very nuclear level, or there's something that's just directly inconsistent with the narrative of the Bhagavatam itself. These are the primary reasons where you find some point of disagreement, like Sridhar Swami's comment that the gopis were guilty of sin for having kama towards Krishna. Sorry, Jiva Goswami's not going to accept that, So we saw in the book Sandarbha this huge vakya, refuting that over the course of many, anuchedas. So, when it comes to something like the dignity of the gopis or, some very, very fine points that are very to the heart of what Mahaprabhu and what the bhajan process of the Gaudiya Sampradaya is about, in those respects, he comes forward to present another viewpoint out of, necessity, but in a very respectful manner. So, at least for me, this one remark in Charitamrita that Mahaprabhu made on one occasion to Vallabhabhatta, that we're going to put that on the throne, and then all this analysis and all this discussion that the Goswamis did is now all like in check because of this one statement that he made. It's like, what was his intention at the time that he was speaking to Vallabhacharya? He had an intention, he had a scope of intent for what he was saying at that time. And the Goswamis, who discussed and consulted with him extensively, intimately, that they were not like aware of his preferences in this regard. It's like impossible. It's like that's like a statement made to like kind of like an outsider. But to an insider, you can discuss so many subtleties, so many tensions, so many finer points that you might not be able to say, because people, unless they have the context and an established relationship with you and an appreciation for the subtlety of your line of thought, they might not understand where you're coming from. So amongst, we have to infer that, the direction that the Goswamis took on the basis of Sridhar Swami's work was very much in line with and attuned to what Mahaprabhu would have wanted.
Mm-hmm. So then, to really touch up so many interesting points we just said, I'm not sure I don't want to stretch too much, but if as we say, as you mentioned, that it's a constant development of Siddhanta or refinement of Siddhanta, I would say, is that later commentators after Goswami, Vishwanath and Baladev, Vidyabhushan, would their contribution would be more refined or just different opinion?
In my view, case by case. In other words, I would go far as to say I think Chakravarti Pad has made some significant contributions. He's drawn out some important subtleties. He's balanced or addressed certain gray areas, if you will, that are extremely valuable and extremely edifying to the body of Gaudiya literature. But there are also opinions that are, you could say, parallel or that are alternate, but not necessarily advancing or furthering the discourse, but complementing it or broadening it, if you will. So, according to context, we might see, a range of outcomes, if you will, if we look at their works.
So for this reason, Baba sticks to Goswamis primarily?
Well, one of Baba's principles is that special regard is always to be sustained for the Nityasiddha Partikaras. And that their authority is axiomatic, whereas everyone else's is relative to that. This is like a general hermeneutic, if you will, that he follows. One way I've heard him explain it is with an analogy that one time some Vaishnavas from Bengal came to visit our Dadu Guru Maharaj, and they were just, talking, how are you, how's life, and then one of them saying, oh, we're having a land dispute. And he said, oh, what's the problem? And, because traditionally there's villages, and then in the areas between the villages are big common areas of land, and certain families own different plots out in these, 2-3 whatever kilometer wide fields, and they may use them for cow grazing or agriculture or whatever. So there was some dispute because someone wanted to sell one of the plots out in this big field, and then they were coming to establish where that plot was exactly, and then the surrounding owners, no one was agreeing where the borders were on the field. So he wasn't able to sell the land, and therefore it was stuck, and this was his problem. So he just, shared a report of this when the Dadu Maharaj asked him how things were going. So when the Dadu Maharaj heard all of this, then he gave a suggestion. He said, I'll bet this is the problem. You do this. When you go back to Bengal, you go back and take the measurements of the plot again. But the direction that you came out from your village to measure the plot, don't come from that side. Come from the opposite side and do the measurement, and I'll bet it'll match. And that's what happened. He went back and he had been measuring it, but it was an asymmetrical plot, so he was measuring it from one side, and then the asymmetry was going off onto the other people's property, but when you just did the same measurements from the opposite direction, it fit the grid, or it fit the map that the people had. So there's nothing more, there's no spiritual meaning to this story, it's just an analogy to say that when you approach something from the back or from the other direction, things can appear or align in a different way than if you approach it from the front. So applying that as like a loose analogy, Baba's viewpoint is that if you try to understand Gaudiya Vaishnava Dharma from the present into the past, and you rely principally on the lectures that are present in today's society, and then you read 20th century writers, and then maybe you hear a few quotes from a few Goswami books somewhere along the way. What's your idea going to be about Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Oh my God.
Right? And then flip that on its head. Don't listen to anything. Just read the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the Shatsandharma, the Bhagavata Dipika. Just go to the source and then come out from that source as far as necessary. Study the core works and then see after that, do you need this other book written in 18 whatever and this other book from 1920 whatever and whoever's on YouTube saying this and that? At least in my experience, you don't need that stuff. If you just go to the actual core, you can get things so clear and so straight that all this other stuff is just superfluous. It's just a jungle of confusing, mixed up, cherry-picked, sound bit, jumbled talk, aimed at, some mixture of appearing authoritative / popular / interesting / different / whatever is the ambition of who's ever trying to put themselves out there, or whatever. So, anyway, I'm getting a little too loose here, but my point is just that, if we go to the source, we go to that core element, that our ultimate spiritual aspiration, followers of the works of Rupa Goswami, the path of Raganuga Bhakti, is the eternal service of those nitya parikaras with the heart absorbed in that type of bhav. This is what is the goal. There's no other goal than that. So when that very goal, when you have books written by those very people, when those very people that you aspire to serve, they themselves wrote the books, how to follow them, then no, don't read those, just listen to all these other people, cherry pick some quotes out of them. It's just study their words, go direct to that source, understand that directly, and then where there's any gray area, where there's any subtlety, where there's any further application that needs refinement, then, okay, let's look historically what's happened after these texts were written, what sub-commentators or later, developments happened that dealt with the application or the interpretation of these texts, then little by little there may be some relevance or application to other things. But the core orientation, the core content is that substance that the Nitya Parikaras themselves revealed by the direct order of Mahaprabhu himself. There's nothing more authoritative, there's nothing more rock solid, there's no way to integrate the object that you seek and the means that you seek to attain it more congruently and strongly than that. So go there, start with that, and then as required, see what else is there that may be supportive or helpful in imbibing and following that. And then, someone like Vishwanath Chakravarti, is highly beneficial. He genuinely contributed greatly and greatly enhanced and assisted in understanding what the Goswamis taught and the path that they chalked out. So, therefore, he has such a position of universal and high regard throughout our Sampradaya. And that's based on, you could say, critical, impartial analysis of the content of his ideas. Not that he's from this lineage and we're in that lineage, or he's from this region and we're from that region, or he's the, proprietor of this building and we also serve in this building, or any of these other superficialities by which people want to align themselves or justify what they're doing on some kind of loyalty or whatever. There's nothing like that, right? It's the core content of the beauty of his poetry and his thoughts. That's where he stands. That's his dignity. He doesn't need any kind of superficiality, any kind of artificial authority beyond that. The classic Subhashitam is there. A king is honored in his own country, but a wise man is honored all over the world. In other words, the person who attains authority by means of management or by means of popularity and charisma and all of this, he'll get a lot of power within a limited circle. But someone who truly has wisdom, that person will be honored everywhere. And he doesn't have to do any kind of gimmicks to be honored as such.
Thank you. This is very nice. Jai Radhe.
Jai Radhe. Pardon me if I'm elaborating excessively, but...
No, perfect. On spot. Thank you.
Cool. All right, well, let's conclude for the night, and we'll continue further in our next reading. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe.
Shri Radhe. Hari Om.
Yeah, thank you, Baba.